Hi, this is the Change Truth podcast where I'm talking to people about drugs, addiction, and mental health. This time I'm speaking with Kevin Parker, and Kevin is a registered clinical counselor with his own practice on Vancouver Island, and he's also organizing an event in Victoria where he's bringing together a whole number of people to talk about psychedelics in psychotherapy. So on this podcast, we talk a lot about that. We get into some of the studies that are being done now with LSD and MDMA, and we talk about some other substances that might have potential to be used in a therapeutic way. But before we get into that, we talk about our own personal experiences with some things, specifically with ayahuasca, because Kevin is someone who does have a lot of experience with ayahuasca. And this was also supposed to be another video podcast, but unfortunately I messed up and I tried to record at the highest possible graphic settings, and the video just didn't turn out. My computer wasn't fast enough to keep up with that. So live and learn, but the audio turned out just great, so definitely give it a listen. This is me with Kevin Parker.
You know, I was a teenager in the late 60s, early 70s, right? I don't know how old you are, but I'm going to turn 60 in August. And that was quite a time for psychedelics, actually, because I don't know if you remember Timothy Leary or have ever heard of Timothy Leary, but
Yeah.
you know, there was the pioneers in the field. Some of them were kind of rascals. Some of them were serious researchers. And so, yeah, I had an exposure to psychedelics at a fairly young age. I also had an interest in meditation and spirituality at a fairly young age too. And I'll share something with you. I had an experience when I was about 17 that could be described as something Stan Groff refers to as a spiritual emergency. I had a shift in consciousness that was quite profound, and I didn't have the maturity to deal with it at the time, and I didn't have the context to hold it. And so I ended up being actually hospitalized for a time and given some very strong antipsychotic medication.
Okay.
But it was, I think, the only substances I'd used up to that point were marijuana and hashish.
Okay.
So this was not a psychedelic experience. It was something that I don't know why. I mean, I had been doing some meditation, but it was very profound. But it was very unsettling in some ways too.
So describe it. Like, what did that look like? Was that sort of like a schizophrenic episode, or?
Well, it was actually the only place that the psychiatrist knew to sort of frame it was, I think that it was labeled schizophrenic with paranoid ideation or something like that.
Okay. And how old were you?
I was 17.
Oh, 17. You're quite young.
Yeah.
And how long did that sort of last for?
It lasted for several weeks until I was hospitalized, and then, back then they used something called Thorazine, which was a antipsychotic medication, and the experience eventually wore off. But it was, I guess, it could be described as just a profound state of authenticity and awakening. And so that experience, though, sort of informed the rest of my life in some ways, because my interest in what had happened was piqued.
Right.
And then, there were a few years of, I can only describe as sort of chaotic volatility. And my experiences with psychedelics during those years were a little bit unsettling, because once again, I don't think I had the maturity or the holding environment to really know how to work with those substances. So it wasn't until after a while I stopped doing everything, smoking pot, psychedelics, everything, for about 25 years, except alcohol.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You took a break from everything around you were probably 20 or so?
20, around 20, I think around 24 or 5, I totally quit everything.
Okay, and you by that time experimented with more than just marijuana. You had tried a few things.
Yeah, psilocybin, LSD. Yeah.
Right. Those are the big ones going around at that time, I guess, right?
Hmm.
That's what
Yeah, and
Leary
that's
and those guys were really promoting.
yeah. There was something going around at the time too. People said called it THC, but it was actually people were selling it was THC, and it was the active ingredient in marijuana. But people were actually selling THC, but it was actually PCP, which is a heavy duty animal tranquilizer that is not a pleasant experience.
Right. Yeah, there were lots of different like ketamine and sort of all sorts of different things floating around coming up at that time too. Like, yeah.
Yeah, ketamine's an interesting one now. There's a lot of psychiatrists that are looking at ketamine as a working with ketamine for depression.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. It's and there's clinical test studies going on right now um, that they think it might be a useful tool for helping in depression.
I actually don't know that much about ketamine myself. What is the natural source of ketamine? Where does it come from? Do you know?
I don't know if there is a natural source. I think it's a chemical compound, as far as I know.
Okay.
It was invented
Right.
probably by a pharmaceutical company.
I think I had heard that it was a horse tranquilizer at some point, but I don't know if that's accurate. Maybe not.
Yeah, I'm not really. I've never experimented with it, and I'm not really familiar with it.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you took a long break then until it
Mhm.
sounds like you were in your 40s or 50s maybe when you
No, actually,
started?
I was close to 50 actually,
Hmm.
and I was went back to grad school at the California Institute of Integral Studies.
Right.
Are you familiar with that school?
You had linked me to it. Yeah, so I did check it
Okay,
out.
yeah.
It was very interesting. They were definitely um, sort of promoting themselves as being on the front lines with these kind of psychedelic research studies and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah, and they are. So I was while I was at CIIS that I heard murmurings about ayahuasca
Mm.
and had spoken to some people who had been in ceremony and it was interesting because as soon as I kind of decided that that's something I wanted to try, then it was everywhere. I was getting emails. I was stumbling upon blog posts and websites, and then somebody called and said, "Hey, there's a friend down in Santa Cruz that is hosting something, and if you're interested, give him a call." And so I did, and yeah, it was that was amazing.
Right.
Uh, it was probably, the most intense and profound ayahuasca experience I've ever had was that first one.
The first one.
Yeah, yeah, and I've probably drank ayahuasca probably close to 100 times since then.
Really? Wow.
Uh, and it's always interesting and educating
Mm.
but nothing has rivaled the profundity of that initial experience.
It's funny that you mentioned like this is something now I've talked about ayahuasca with a number of people on and off the podcast, and something that like comes up with seems like with everyone is everyone who's at some point heard about ayahuasca and then decided that they were going to do it, they all report just it coming into their life randomly, like whether it
Mm-hmm.
was ayahuasca or just DMT. Trevor Miller, who I know you know, one thing he told me is when he first read about DMT, he just first found it in a book and thought, "Oh man, that sounds really interesting. I want to try that." Like the next day, he was offered DMT. Like after not hearing about it ever, it's kind of like this
Yeah,
weird synchronicity thing that people just keep reporting, and I don't know what that means or if that's a sort of a coincidence thing, but it's just funny that that's what a lot of people say is once they make that decision that they want to do it, it kind of finds them.
it does. Yeah, yeah, that kind of thing is not. It doesn't seem surprising to me anymore.
Mm,
Because I think when you work with entheogens or when you work with different states of consciousness, a lot of times there is a realization that we are connected in a
right.
multitude of ways and we are not separate. And so the fact that I guess the fact that those kind of things happen shouldn't surprise us in a way, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get used to that, it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, that's you
Yeah.
know.
I mean, one idea that I've sort of repeatedly, it's really been reinforced in me after doing these things, is this idea that my mental state and my mind and my thoughts are like as connected to what happens in my life as the physical sort of world, and what I'm thinking about is going to manifest in some way or another, whether it's just me acting upon it at some time or what. And I don't know. I mean, they're fun ideas. It's kind of at this, it kind of becomes sort of wishy-washy. I don't know. It's hard to say, but they're fun ideas to play with, these sort of synchronicity, mind manifesting, the secret sort of ideas. But I mean, so you have done ayahuasca like close to 100 times. That's a lot. Have you gone down to do it in Peru and Brazil and those kind of places, or have you always been able to find it in?
Done it in BC, in California, in Hawaii, in Mexico, but I've never traveled down to South America.
Oh, really? So have you done it then in the same way that they do it, like with a shaman, or is it done? Have you been doing it in different styles?
No, most of the people that I've worked with have been trained in South America.
Okay.
Most of them in Peru.
Right. Yeah, I did ayahuasca for the first time last year. I went to a retreat in Peru and did 4 ayahuasca sessions over like a 8-day period.
Were you in Iquitos?
Yeah, right nearby Iquitos, yeah.
Can I ask you who you worked with?
Yeah, like the shaman and the retreat. Yeah, there's a place called Spirit Quest Sanctuary. It's run by a man named Howard Lawler. Yeah, an American man. And it was it was really, really interesting, great experience. I mean, yeah, I mean, I could go into detail. I mean, it was awesome. I mean, I personally, after doing ayahuasca, I think that just in terms of what helps me the most and what I get the most from, I personally use mushrooms, and I think I get more from the use of psilocybin mushrooms than I did from ayahuasca. But it was only my first time trying it too, and I think with ayahuasca the dosage seemed harder to really pinpoint, to get the right amount and whatnot. But
yeah.
And it was interesting. I've never done mushrooms in that sort of shamanic context, so just that alone was a very interesting experience. And
so, were they also working with psilocybin on the retreat you were at?
No, but they did also work with San Pedro. But I didn't I didn't try that. But they did sort of like a thing where the first week was with ayahuasca, second week San Pedro, which they call Wachuma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I mean, everyone else who stayed for that, they said that a lot of them resonated more with the Wachuma experience than they did with the ayahuasca. So I wish that I had been able to try it. I'm sure someday I will, but
yeah, it's much more. It's a much more gentle experience in a lot of ways, and maybe more subtle too. That's what I've found.
You've tried San Pedro as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like the ayahuasca experience is more like you do it at night. You're going to end up throwing up most likely. Most people end up throwing up and whatnot. But when they describe doing the Wachuma, they walk, or they do it in the middle of the day. They end up walking around doing sort of activities.
Yeah.
There's like different stages to it where you're not just sort of sitting alone on a mat in a dark room. You're sort of exploring more and stuff.
Well, it's also very relational to what can happen with Wachuma. It's people describe it as a medicine for the heart, and from what I've seen in Wachuma ceremonies, people are very very connected and relational.
Right. So
yeah, different. But I mean, when you talk about psilocybin or ayahuasca or Wachuma, each plant has its own particular personality or spirit,
right.
If you, and they're very different in some ways, and they're very different in the ways that they talk to you, and they're very different, I think, in what they show you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems that way, and that's what the people down there, like the people who I worked with, they had that belief that each plant had its own spirit, and you're working with that spirit of the plant, and it's like it's a relationship. They talked about it as a relationship where you learn from each other. It's a give and take. It's not just like they just cure you of everything or whatever. You have to work with them, kind of.
Yeah, which is it's kind of a foreign concept to Westerners that you have a relationship with a plant.
Well, totally. It's a crazy idea.
Mhm. But we do. I mean, we have a relationship with everything that we put into our bodies,
Hmm.
from the food we eat to whatever we drink to the air we breathe. It's
Right.
all relationship. It's all give and take, right?
Hmm. So you've
So,
obviously had a lot of experience with different substances, from mushrooms to San Pedro, ayahuasca, etc. What do you think? I mean, you've done ayahuasca 100 times. What do you think is happening when you're taking these things? Do you think I've talked to some people who believe in a spirit world? There's like a literal spirit world where they're communicating with spirits and
mm,
entities. Some people think it's just going into your own mind and whatnot. What is your take on what happens?
honestly, I don't know. Um, there was a time when the first time I drank ayahuasca, I was actually taken on board a spaceship with these light beings that told me they were from 9 billion years in the future.
It's a long time in the future.
They were seeding new universes, and they said, this is what humanity is evolving toward. You become the creator gods. And so it was like, yeah, beings, spirit beings, wow, mind blowing.
Hmm.
And then I remember one of the last time with drinking ayahuasca in Mexico, and I felt like I was getting a download from an entity, and it was like, oh, Mama Ayahuasca is teaching me. And then all of a sudden, it was like there was no Mama Ayahuasca, there was no separate spirit,
Hmm.
there was only one. And everything that we imagine to be separate is just a concept.
Hmm.
It's just a concept in our mind.
Right. I've heard that experience reported. A number of like other people have had that same feeling where boundaries dissolve and yeah, that feeling of we're all one. Everything is connected. We're all one. That's a very common experience to many of these substances, LSD and ayahuasca and
Yeah.
whatnot.
You realize it's all God playing hide and seek.
Right, right.
And so, I think after that experience, I've dropped into a place where I can honor this role
Mm,
that I apparently have been given in this incarnation.
mm,
But behind that is a recognition that there is no separation. There is no separation.
right. It kind of it humbles you a little bit in your everyday life and in encountering other people, and when you realize we are connected so much, whether we are all one or whether we're just connected in ways that sort of go beyond our understanding, you just kind of it helps humble a person, I think, to go through that experience.
Yeah, I mean, because I heard Ramdas describe it in a really interesting way one time. He said, if your left hand was moving toward a hot fire and getting burned, and your right hand reached over and pulled it out, that's the same analogy as helping someone else.
Right.
When we help someone else, we're helping each other because there is no fundamentally no separation.
Right. Yeah, I like this analogy as well. Like when you, if you talk about sort of sick members of our society, or people who maybe talk about like homeless people, or drug addicts, or people who are sort of looked down upon and whatnot. There's someone, I don't know who made this analogy, but I really liked it, was that when you look at a plant, if you look at some of the leaves on a plant, and some of them are dying and they're shriveled up and they're brown, you don't like blame the leaf. You're not like, that's a stupid leaf. What a dumb leaf to die like that or whatever, to be sick. No, you look at the plant and go, oh, probably the whole plant probably needs more water. The whole system probably needs to help. It's, it's all, we're all connected in that sort of way. Anyway, I like that. But one thing that was interesting too is I mean, your first ayahuasca experience, having the experience of being on some kind of spaceship or encountering these alien, that's a very commonly reported thing too. And in was it Rick Strassman who did the DMT studies? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he wrote a book, The Spirit Molecule. about doing all these studies. And that was something reported a lot there too, as people encountering these aliens who were maybe doing tests on them or could feel them working on them in some way, or maybe trying to teach them something. And so DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. It's also something that we produce in our own bodies, and it's reported that we produce it when we sleep, in deep sleep. And so some people sort of theorize that that's the sort of alien abduction experience that is reported by people could be related to maybe natural sources of DMT being flooded in our brain or something, and then having this experience but not knowing what's going on in it, because that experience on ayahuasca or DMT sounds very similar to people who report being abducted by aliens.
Yeah.
It's very, very similar. There's some like being of light in some room where they're lying down and they're being probed or something and then sent back.
Well, it's interesting because the first ayahuasca experience I had, the beginning of the experience, I was on another spaceship that wasn't so benevolent, and I was being experimented on, and the thought came to me was this is my reality. My life on Earth had been a screen memory that they had implanted into me, so they could do this to me, and I was caught up in total terror. So this was within the first hour of drinking my first time, and my heart was pounding, my ears were ringing, I was physically feeling terrible, and I'd been a Vipassana meditator for probably close to 15 years, and I sat up and I said, "This experience is." I volunteered for this experience to learn something, and I'm going to accept whatever comes. And I took a few breaths, and immediately the whole scene shifted, and then I was on the other ship.
Oh, the laser ship.
Yeah.
Right. That's something that's mentioned a lot. Well, where I went to do the ayahuasca, they mentioned that quite often is to just go with whatever happened, to accept whatever happens and not be afraid, and you're going to be okay. Trust the medicine, And then when you do that, you have a better experience, but more maybe pleasant, or some of these, you can stop some of these scary things if you just accept them. And that's,
yeah, this is an analogy for every aspect of our life. Pema Chodron, the Buddhist monk that has written so many excellent books, has a book called Go to the Places That Scare You. And, this is a primary tenet of Tibetan Buddhism too, and Tantra also, that you open and you accept. You stop rejecting your experience.
Right.
And when you stop rejecting your experience, then that resistance that was causing you to suffer will let go.
I would say that was, when I did ayahuasca, that was the biggest thing that I took away from the whole experience, was this idea of not being afraid anymore, to just accept that fear is a sort of a construct, that we're so afraid of all these things, and I have anxiety in certain situations, and how that's just me like projecting these insecurities and stuff, and to really try to live life without fear, and to really try to do that, try to express myself and do whatever I want to do without being afraid of being judged or being any of this stuff. And that was the biggest message I took away from the ayahuasca. And I know I had gone in with sort of expectations, because you hear so much when you decide to go do it. I mean, for me, I just started researching it, trying to read other people's experiences, trying to figure, and you hear so much about people having experiences where they like encounter things from their past, maybe their parents are arguing, or traumatic events come up, and I was expecting stuff like that maybe to happen, and I never got any of that stuff. I never went back into my past as an observer, didn't really meet any dead relatives or anything like that. But I just got this message that I should not be afraid. And that was very powerful. And that was really something that I took away from that since then. I've tried to act that more and more in day-to-day life, stop rejecting things, and just trying to go with the flow more. And
Yeah.
it's a pretty powerful thing to happen, you know.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So when you've done ayahuasca this many times, you've obviously done it with different people, different
Mhm.
scenarios. What have you found to be the most beneficial type of situation to do ayahuasca? I'm sure you've probably done it with different sizes of groups, different sort of styles of having a ceremony and whatnot. What have you resonated most with?
Well, I mean, one thing, you were just describing what people had, sort of prepped you for going into an experience, and you were saying, well, but none of these things happened. I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that I learned from ayahuasca is uh, you never know what you're going to get, and even if it's a different set and setting. Or the same setting doesn't mean you're going to repeat an experience.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, I've been working with one particular person for the last 6 or 7 years, and I've gone outside and done other things. But I guess the holding environment is important in that it's good to know who you're working with, and know that and feel that there's somebody you can trust.
Right.
So, I don't know if you've heard, but there's been a lot in the last few years about ethical violations that have occurred in ayahuasca ceremonies, and I'm not going to elaborate on them because I everything I hear is hearsay, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if people do the research and if they're going into ceremony, I think it's really important that they do the research. They find out who they're working with. They find out who that person trained with, and they talk to other people who have worked with that person, right? So that sense of safety, I think, is very important. Even though taking ayahuasca itself, is not, there's no safety guaranteed in the experience,
Sure.
right? And what you're going to encounter, but I think that holding environment, and this is something that's going to come up at the Psychedelic Psychotherapy Forum, set and setting for any psychedelic experience is tantamount, and I think that that's probably the difference between my early psychedelic experiences and then what I experience now. The set and setting is profoundly different. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, it was pretty random how we ingested.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one time taking psilocybin and going to the racetrack. I mean, it was
God.
and I had actually a pretty interesting experience, to say the least. But it's not something that I'd want to repeat. And and I guess with just maybe maturity and a different intention at this time in my life, that's become really important. Set and setting has become really important.
Right. And yeah, that's something repeated often by proponents of psychedelics, because it's hard to talk about these things because you do it, like, the worst fear is that someone's going to go, oh man, that sounds like a cool experience. I want to do mushrooms. And they go take mushrooms with someone they don't trust, or some people who are going to mess with them, or at a racetrack or something, and they have a terrible time, or then they mix it with something they shouldn't mix it with, and there's all sorts of risk. And the trust thing is big, I think, as well, because when you're in some experience like this where you are facing, who knows, maybe you're going to face something really scary and you're going to panic and you're going to go, oh my God, I'm dying. Some people have the death experience where they think they're dying. And you have to, at that point, know that, like, okay, no, the person I'm doing this with knows what they're doing. They gave me the right amount. They know how much to give me. They know I'm going to be okay. If anything is wrong, they're going to help me. I'm okay. Like, you can trust who you're with and trust the situation. Whereas if you don't, if you're at a party, some rave, and there's drunk people and there's whatever that you don't even know, and you have an experience like that, that's going to be really scary, and it's going to be hard to ground yourself because you don't have someone to help you.
Well, the other thing too is the psychedelic experience can make you extremely vulnerable too. When you're in a vulnerable state like that, I mean, I work as a psychotherapist, so and I work a lot with trauma, and so when we work with trauma, there's a word we use. It's called titration, and titration means that you. It's like driving a car. You know when to put the gas on, and you know when to put the brakes on.
Okay.
And so in the experience of in the psychedelic experience, that holding environment is so important because if the person is not held in a safe and secure and loving context, the experience could be traumatizing. If they're working with trauma, they could be re-traumatized.
I see, right. Yeah, that makes sense. Because, yeah, it's true. You are very vulnerable. And I think it's sometimes too, like with mushrooms, I find I'm very just like open to any stimulus. Like if I'm with someone, they say one word that just triggers a whole thought pattern. Like I just start going off down this road. And if you're around some scary situation while you're in this state or something happens, that could be very traumatic, I think.
Yeah. So set and setting is huge. And as we move toward some of these substances gaining credibility and acceptability as therapeutic tools, that's going to be something that's really going to be looked at. Like, there's a study right now on MDMA that's taking place in Vancouver.
In Vancouver? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And, this is the first clinical study in Canada that's really ever happened with MDMA as being looked at as a therapeutic tool. So I'm sure the people that are conducting the research there are going to be very interested in what kind of set and setting creates the optimum experience for a client wanting to work with entheogens. Back in the 60s, before a lot of these substances became banned or class 1 substances, there were some really good therapists that were working with, like Stan Groff. I don't know if you know Stan's work at all.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
I mean, he was mostly working with LSD in Czechoslovakia back in the early 60s. Yeah. And, he would do 4 and 5, 6 hour, 7 hour sessions with people on, fairly high dose LSD. And, but it was in a clinical setting. I mean, as a psychiatrist, he was there with the person throughout the experience.
I mean, there were even people in Saskatchewan, I think in the 60s, around there, that were using, I think, LSD. And it was in a mental institution.
Oh yeah. I forget the name, but I have read about that study. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was people maybe in sort of that Timothy Leary circle, but I don't know exactly who it was. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But there was a history of use. I mean, it's kind of funny to have maybe having them become illegal was really a blessing in the long run, because maybe now people they have to prove the right way to use them and prove that they are safe, and that might help create a more responsible use of them in the future, because now people really have to get behind the science and test the set and setting and find out what works and try to get it approved and, whereas maybe if they never became illegal, maybe they would take off and be more destructive in the long run. I mean, who knows?
Well, it's hard to say, and this is actually an area of great debate, I think, for a lot of people, because some people feel that there's something to be said for the recreational use of certain psychedelic substances.
Yeah.
And so where do you draw the line? I mean, if you take psilocybin and go just out into the woods by yourself and sit by a river, is that recreational? Is that therapeutic?
Yeah.
If you take LSD and go to a Grateful Dead or a Fish concert, right, would you consider that? I guess most people would consider that recreational, but it doesn't necessarily preclude that somebody might not have a profoundly transformative experience, right?
Yeah, totally. No, I think, I often when trying to just make the case for psychedelics, I often talk about this setting and say, okay, no, it's a hugely different thing when someone is taking, say, MDMA with a counselor as opposed to taking it at a rave. And I use that example, like, listen, if you're at a party taking this, there's way more risks, etc. But I also do think that, like, there's probably something very powerful and good and beneficial about maybe taking MDMA at a dance party and dancing with a whole bunch of people who are also on it and getting into the music and just feeling that powerful feeling of whatever expression and just going with the flow and being whatever. I mean, there are risks with that too, but I think that's probably something that maybe over time we will learn, that like these group psychedelic experiences are powerful too, like in this kind of way.
And once again, it's prudent to do your research even before you go to a rave, because if you buy ecstasy on the street, 9 times out of 10 you're not getting MDMA, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the major problems with it being illegal, is that it's not regulated by like responsible bodies who can, like when you buy alcohol, it's got the percentage listed on the bottle, you know exactly how much is in there, etc. But when you buy a pill from a dealer, you don't really know what the hell's in there. So
I had a friend that worked with another gentleman that they actually set up tables at raves to where people could bring their
to test them.
To test them. Yeah,
I've heard of that. Yeah, I forget the name now, but they were doing that in California, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, it was to test the ecstasy for people, and they said the cops didn't mess with them because the cops knew like that's a good thing. They didn't just like wait by the booth and arrest everybody who came by or whatever,
Right. Yeah.
Because you want to know if there's like speed in your ecstasy or whatever. Yeah. It's going to make a difference.
Yeah, and the sad fact is that a lot of people have died. And the other thing too is that self-care piece. Even if it is pure MDMA you're consuming, stay hydrated, for Christ's sake.
Right,
listen to your body. Know what it's telling you.
Yeah. And even if you're at a party, there's a good chance you'll be drinking too. So if you're drinking alcohol and you're taking MDMA, and then someone offers you a joint or whatever, then all of a sudden you got a cocktail going on that, I mean, you got to be really careful. It could catch up to you, right?
Cocktail that only Jim Morrison could have handled.
Yeah. So, but I mean, it sounds like from the current research that's happening and everything, it seems like the way that these are going to come into our society in a legal way is going to be in a sort of counseling or therapeutic setting. I mean, that's the studies that are being done now with post-traumatic stress disorder and these anxiety disorders and whatnot. MDMA and LSD and psilocybin are showing potential to be used, and it seems like that's the way they're going to come in to our society. So at least initially. So what do you think are the best ones as far as that goes? Like, what are the most beneficial?
I'm not familiar with. I'll hold it up. Have you seen this article? It was in the New Yorker magazine. Science and Psychedelic. What is it?
Is that a new one?
It's in Psychedelic Revolution, and it was written by Michael Pollan, who's written several actually great bestsellers on food. And the article is about the therapeutic use of psychedelics. In this article, what they're pointing to mostly is research that's being done on LSD and psilocybin. But I think probably the thing about LSD, it's people. The word has pejorative connotations for a lot of people. Just because of its history. It's what Albert Hoffman, who invented it, referred to as his problem child, right?
Yeah.
I think as far as if I was a betting man, I would say probably the first psychedelic or entheogen that's going to be used in a therapeutic setting legally in Canada or the United States will probably be MDMA.
Right.
And then that will probably open the doors for more. And, there's research being done at reputable universities on LSD, psilocybin. We mentioned ketamine earlier. And it gets a little trickier, I think, with ayahuasca because so much of the ayahuasca experience has to do with the ceremonial context. with the singing of the Icaros, with with the lineage of the curanderos, all of that. I think it would be a difficult one right now to test clinically.
Yeah, and maybe just a hard sell for the public as well. It's so different. It's so hard to grasp for someone who's not into any of this stuff to then talk about shamans and singing and all this stuff. Whereas when you have this controlled study with MDMA and this more specific dose, and it maybe is more easy for people to relate to how that works.
Well, that's true. And at the same time, I don't know if you've noticed, but ayahuasca is showing up everywhere. It's showing up on CNN. It's showing up in the movies. Apparently, there's some new film that's come out, major motion picture, where an ayahuasca ceremony is part of the film.
No way.
Yeah, and on the radio talk shows. So it's like its tendrils are going like this. So I think that's going to make it probably maybe a little more palatable for the general public to be able to accept that this is something that people find useful.
Maybe. It's funny that, I mean, for me, I've after launching this project of mine where I'm talking to people about these sort of things, and when I talk to people, it's so funny how many people who I talk to have never tried any psychedelic. They've never even had an interest in mushrooms or LSD or anything, but they've heard of ayahuasca, and they're just so intrigued by ayahuasca for whatever reason, for whatever they've heard about its healing properties, or people are drawn to it for some reason. It does have a sort of pull for people.
Well, one thing about ayahuasca, it definitely can't be classified as a recreational drug. And most of the what people talk about when they go after they've been at a ceremony is its healing potential. I mean, that's one thing that I have noticed in ceremony. After the ceremony closes and people are sharing intention that night or the next morning, I've seen firsthand people make extraordinary breakthroughs in one thing, maybe accessing deeply recessed psychological material and working through it, so I think that's, with LSD, people do still take it recreationally. And I'm sorry, I forgot what you just said, and I'm going off on a tangent.
Oh no, it's all good. We were talking about how ayahuasca cannot really be used recreationally.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, ayahuasca tends to make you either puke or end up on the toilet or both, and kind of it's kind of difficult to move around on ayahuasca as well. So whereas like something like LSD, you're pretty clear-minded and you can move around, like you're still with it in general. I mean, I don't have a lot of LSD experience personally either, so I'm not an expert on LSD, but ayahuasca is something that you don't really see people trying to take it and go to a party or something. It's not really what it is.
No, although, I haven't been to Peru, but I understand, though, that there are some rather irresponsible people that are just selling it on the street now, like selling bottles of it in Iquitos. And so.
It's becoming really touristy down there. And that's what people do have to be careful, like you mentioned earlier, of trying to research who it is you're taking this with or who's administering it. Because just because you can make ayahuasca doesn't mean you're a shaman or you have experience using this stuff or you know what you're doing. The recipe's not that hard now. Like the recipe's out there. You find the two plants and you mix them and you boil them for a long time. And I mean, you got to be careful and there's also like bad people can make a bit of a different mixture where they add different ingredients. I've heard of datura being something that's very dangerous to add because people have had bad side effects with it.
Yeah. Datura is also known as Toei, and it's something that Carlos Castaneda wrote about when he was working with Don Juan.
Right.
And it's a very powerful. It can be used as a tool, but it can also be used nefariously.
Sure.
There's an expression that somebody toed somebody that if somebody wanted to take advantage of somebody, for instance,
Right.
they could use datura or toei to do that, because it renders it can often render the user incapacitated. So
Right.
yeah, there's lots of different admixtures that go into ayahuasca, mimosa, or I think it's called chirisananga. But a skilled curandero will know what the plants are and what their purpose is and who to give it to, right?
Yeah, and that's where, like, personally, like, I think probably I would probably resonate very well with ayahuasca if I had practiced in its use and I knew how to create it and dose it and everything. But the reason, I think one of the reasons I prefer mushrooms is because it's so easy to dose. Like, you can really accurately dose yourself or whoever you're with will. Whereas ayahuasca, you kind of have to trust whoever made it, that they know how much to put in of each and everything, how much to give you and everything.
And even that is no guarantee that you'll know what's coming, because
True, yeah.
I've found, I mean, I've gone through periods where I've drank like for a couple months. When I would go to drink, nothing would happen. I might just throw up, and people were having profound,
Right.
experiences, and nothing was going on. So you even I've seen instances where a small person took a large dose and nothing happened, and a large person took a small dose and everything happened.
Totally.
So
yeah, that was my experience down in Peru as well. I was with a large group. There was like 25 people, and so there was a whole variety of experiences. And there were some people who we did it 4 times total, and some people every single time they experienced nothing. They didn't throw up. They didn't have any vision. They didn't nothing. And it was great. And even for me, like, I had to take quite like and this was something expressed by the shamans there and people running it, was that the dose wasn't as important as maybe we thought it was. Whereas, like, it's going to be more about your intention and or how ready you are, or what, and maybe the dose, it's not all about the dose. It seemed like maybe it's about getting to the breakthrough dose, like getting enough to get you to that point, and then from there it's kind of more just what you're ready for and what it decides to give you or whatever, But I, like, for me down there, I did the first 2 times, the first 2 nights I did it, I took this like the regular dose of everyone, and I didn't have much. It was very light experiences. So the 3rd night, because I had paid this money to go down there and I made this whole trip out of it, and it's a pretty big thing, I wanted to make sure I didn't go back home thinking, oh man, I should have done more. I didn't, so the 3rd night I was like, okay, double the dose. I want to make sure I get there. Like, and then for me that worked. When I drank a lot more, I got into the biggest experience I had down there.
Yeah. I don't drink very much these days because I don't feel like, well, for one thing, the fireworks and visuals don't hold that much for me anymore. It's more about how can I open the heart? What can I learn here? And also, I don't know if it has to do with my metabolism, but often with me, I'm not feeling the effects of the medicine sometimes until the ceremony is almost closed.
Right. Yeah.
And that's been really interesting. I actually started a while back, before a ceremony starts, just drinking some of the straight vine, that's been boiled down without the chacruna leaves.
Right. So the vine is the inhibitor, which allows the DMT and the chacruna to work. So by taking just the vine, there's no DMT in the mixture. It's just the inhibitor first.
Right. So what would happen is the MAO inhibitor would be active before I actually drank, and that seemed to expedite the process a bit for me.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that was definitely the case with a lot of people there, and me too. It seemed to come on quite slow for me, and there were some people, like, in a large group. I was the 3rd one to drink each night, I think, and there was often the case where I would be one of the first ones to drink, but I wouldn't feel anything for an hour, whereas like 20 other people had already thrown up. Like, they had already started going through the motions and getting there, where I was just sitting there kind of waiting. and that can be just digestive stuff or metabolism and whatever. I mean, I've had that with when I years ago when friends of mine and me, we took mushrooms, and there was three of us, me and one of my friends. It hit us like normally, like within the first hour, we were feeling it. We got into the whole experience, and then like I think it lasted maybe 4 hours, and then we were ready for bed. We were like, okay, I guess it's worn off. Let's go to bed. And then my two friends were sharing the same room. And so they shut off the lights, went to go to bed, and then when they shut off the lights, then my third friend hadn't felt anything. Then all of a sudden he's like, "You got to turn those lights back on because it just started kicking in." And that was like 4 hours later. And so I mean, even with other things too, it can be different for different people.
I think it has to do with body type and metabolism.
Yeah, how you digest things.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk more about counseling and therapy with these substances, because I think that is kind of how these are going to be brought into our culture, at least some of these things like MDMA maybe, and maybe psilocybin.
This is a great chance to plug the forum then.
Oh yeah, sure, we can talk about that too. Yeah,
we actually did this last year. We did it in my living room here at our house, and there was probably 10 or 15 of us got together. Okay. It was the first psychedelic psychotherapy forum. And it was very sort of an intimate gathering, and we shared stories. We had a guy that's actually going to speak at the October event, Bruce Tobin, had written an excellent piece on just ethically how to navigate, as a therapist, how to navigate using entheogens with clients. What you can, what you can suggest to people. And, a lot of it boiled down to, I mean, the ethical obligations we have as counselors are you working in the best interest of the client? Right. And so that question came up in Bruce's talk, that yes, often these substances might be in the best interest of the client as far as doing the healing work, right? But then you have to look at the legal aspect of it and the stability of a client, and so that's something that we're going to have a whole part of the forum is going to be devoted to how you do this as a counselor, how you do this as a therapist, especially, at this time, none of the substances are available to work with, right? Not legally, right.
Yeah, so that definitely complicates things at this time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at, I'm sure you're familiar with Gabor Maté's work, right?
Yeah, definitely. He came up and spoke in Whitehorse like a couple months ago. I went to see him at a talk he gave. And I'm familiar with a lot of his work for sure. Yeah. Yeah,
well, and then, Gabor, it was around the time he wrote In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts that he had never heard of ayahuasca, but he was working with addicts in the downtown east side in Vancouver. And after he wrote this phenomenal book on addiction, people were coming up to him saying, "Have you heard of ayahuasca?" And then he went down to Peru and he worked with, I think it was Jacques Moby at the clinic he has down in I believe it's Peru. But anyway, he tried it. He saw the potential and he actually brought it back to Vancouver. In fact, the CBC made a documentary on it.
Right, which is kind of how he got shut down, I think.
Exactly.
Spread the word. And
then, as soon as it became public that he was working with a banned substance, Health Canada basically said, stop or you'll lose your medical license, So, and so he's chosen not to work in that context in this country.
In this country, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So
what is the official name of this forum? And are you the main organizer of this?
Yeah. And my wife Pauline has been a great help. Also, she helped develop the website, and it's been the two of us. And then another friend of mine down in Victoria has helped out. Also, Bruce Tobin.
Oh yeah.
But yeah.
So what's the website and what's the name of this?
It's psychedelic is the website.
Okay.
And it's the Psychedelic Psychotherapy, second annual Psychedelic Psychotherapy Forum.
Right. So this is taking place in Victoria, early October of this year.
Yeah, 2nd and 3rd of October. And it'll be at the University Club at UVic, which is University of Victoria.
Right.
Which is it's a beautiful setting, actually. It's right in Victoria, but on the campus, it's set away almost like in a forest. And so it's a very pleasant environment to have a forum in.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I just signed up today, so I'll be going. I'll be there. And
great.
It sounds like you mentioned that Trevor Miller will be speaking, who is the first person that I interviewed on this podcast. He works with Ibogaine, mostly with addicts in Vancouver. So he'll be speaking. Gabor Maté is speaking, right?
Gabor Maté is our keynote. He's going to be speaking on Friday, October 2nd. The first night's going to be mostly about just connecting and conversing. We're doing having a catered dinner. We're going to have some live music. Well, actually, one of the presenters is in it's kind of a world music band, and he's going to play.
Cool.
And Gabor is going to do the keynote. And yeah, I think what I wanted to see happen in the first night is just people connecting. So all the presenters will be there that night and getting to know people. And so we'll have a little bit of that intimacy that we had in the first, the first one. We'll have it there. That's what I'd like to sort of contain in the environment for the next day, Saturday.
That sounds like a good idea. And so you said the max capacity though is like just under 200 people, I think.
I don't think I'd be comfortable with more than 150 in there, and I have a feeling we probably will sell out.
Yeah.
I don't want to really pack people in too tight because, I mean, yeah. So I think, 150 people is what we're hoping for.
So if anyone is interested in attending this, they better get on it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it would be prudent to get your tickets early.
Yeah.
And we do have an early bird discount too. If you register by the end of May, there's a significant savings. So
right. Yeah.
So yeah, we're excited. I mean, back to your question about how therapists work with this. We're going to be looking at the legal and ethical side of it. We're going to be looking at how people can become involved in research partnerships. I don't know when you checked out the CIAS website, but they have just opened I have it here. It's called the Center for Psychedelic Therapy and Research, and they've come aboard as a sponsor, and so people interested in actually becoming involved with research and then potentially becoming psychedelic psychotherapists. It's a great forum for them to be at because I think we're going to have some of the cutting edge people that are going to be involved in that kind of work.
Right. It looked like, I think on your website too, it's you showed us MAPS was one of the sponsors as well. Is that right?
Yeah. MAPS Canada is on board as a sponsor also. And are you familiar with the MAPS organization?
Yeah, totally. It seems like they're one of the leading organizations now with getting a lot of this research underway, and they're doing a lot of the research with MDMA, with PTSD and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Rick Doblin, the founder, has done just a phenomenal job. And he also walks that fine line,
Mm-hmm.
Being able to approach people for donations and to become involved and being able to interface with government organizations and legal or law enforcement and things like that, it's tricky, and I think he does a phenomenal job of it. I was at the MAPS 2013. They had their big it's called Psychedelic Science Fair down at the Marriott in Oakland.
Oh yeah,
and it was an amazing event. Probably the biggest gathering of people interested in this kind of work that's ever happened, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Rick Doblin, he's I guess the founder of MAPS, and I know he's been working at this for a long, long time. Like I think since the '80s or something was when he sort of began the groundwork for MAPS. And he's someone who I think was trained as either a psychologist or a therapist or counselor, and that's what he saw himself doing with these substances, was working with them in that context. But they were illegal, so he kind of took it upon himself to try to change that. And so he's been working at trying to change that for a long, long time here.
Yeah, and doing a great job. If you want to actually read a little more about his history and his story, there's a book that came out last year by Tom Schroeder called Acid Test.
Okay.
Have you seen that?
No, I've never heard of that.
He weaves three different stories together. Rick Doblin's story, Michael Mithofer, who's also a psychiatrist that's done a lot of research with MDMA, and then I forget the third person's name, but it's the story about an Iraqi war vet.
Oh, okay.
And he takes these three separate stories and tells the story of all these people's history, and then how they come together to meet and how this kind of research is impacting their lives.
Right. Oh, that sounds really interesting. What was the name of it again?
It's called Acid Test.
Acid Test.
It's,
okay.
Tom Schroeder is the author.
Yeah, I might have to pick that one up. I think one of the most interesting things about this, is there seems like there are a lot of different ways to use these substances, and the sort of therapy counseling model seems like in our culture that's how it's going to be brought in. But like, I just spoke with someone 2 days ago. I'm just working on editing that podcast before I throw it up, but she is her name is Monica Kromhout, and she is in South Africa, where she's been holding mushroom ceremonies with up to like 30 people. And working in a very, well, I mean, she talks about giving messages by some spirit that talks to her about how to use mushrooms and whatnot. I mean, it's a very out there idea to explain. She explains it very well, and she's very, she's not a crazy person at all. She's very level headed, and I interviewed another person who works with mushrooms in like a very spiritual way. And he said he interacts with spirits directly in the world of spirits, and feels he has a spirit in him and these things. And it's going to be interesting to see, like, as this plays out and as these do come into our culture, just how these other ideas and everything sort of are brought in, because there are people who use these in these very spiritual practices, and it's definitely different from our frame of mind in general in North America.
Are you familiar with Jim Fadiman's work?
No.
I suggest you look him up. He was involved in some of the early LSD research at Stanford back in the 60s. And he's gone on to, he's had quite a career, and a good part of his career has been in academia. He was a professor at CIIS, and then he co-founded Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is now called Sophia in Palo Alto. But he's written several excellent books on entheogens. But he talks about specific dosages and what they're useful for, and he divides it into three categories. And he says at a low dose, psychedelics, and I think he was mostly talking about LSD because that's been a lot what he's worked with primarily. But at a low dose, psychedelics are useful for problem solving. And you even hear about this in Silicon Valley. People are,
yeah, totally
using LSD to actually work out complex, high-tech problems, right?
Yeah.
So low dose problem solving, medium dose is considered useful for therapy, for therapeutic work, working with trauma, working with depression. High dose is for spiritual development. And maybe that's because at the higher doses, that's where the egoic structures start to really become disassembled.
Right.
Now, somebody that hasn't done the therapeutic work might not benefit from the high dose, because if the ego isn't sort of strong and intact in the first place, high dosage can be a little disturbing or disoriented.
Yeah, you might have to work your way up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's another man. I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. His name is Kalindi Ai. Have you ever heard of him?
No,
He's um he's a guy from the United States who
I should write all this down while you're talking. Lindy I.
Kalindi Ai. Uh,
Lindy I. Okay.
yeah, he's a really interesting guy. He's got a couple of talks up on like Vimeo or YouTube, and he's a proponent of high dose psilocybin mushrooms, and he does
Mm-hmm.
up to 30 grams
Mm.
of mushrooms, and the things that he talks about are they're mind blowing and they're inspiring too. It's very interesting. He talks about really getting to these other dimensions, like literal different dimensions where you encounter entities, a lot of entities, a lot of different things. And I mean, he relates it to a lot of past culture. He gives great presentations with a lot of slides and stuff that he talks about. Now, I'm not very familiar with Tibetan Buddhism. Maybe you're more familiar than me, probably. But he talks about there being, now I think it's the mandala is the word,
Mm-hmm.
and it's he talks about it as a map, and the people, the Buddhists see it as a map for the spiritual realm or something. And he talks about these different areas on this mandala, and he talks about when he does these high dose psilocybin, he literally sees or is going to these realms that they were talking about. Like they become
Mm-hmm.
real, these other
Yeah.
places. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that maybe you have to go pretty deep to get to that sort of level, where he talks about like praying mantis creatures and all sorts of crazy stuff that he's encountering. Whereas like me, I've done mushrooms a lot of times, but never super high doses, and I've actually never encountered anything on mushrooms that I would consider a separate entity or being or spirit or
Mm.
alien or anything like that. I did on ayahuasca. I encountered some spirits that I definitely felt were real and separate from myself, but I've never experienced that on mushrooms. But maybe that's a high dose sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's important, I think, to understand that everything we encounter is only relatively real, right?
Sure.
A friend of mine worked with a Buddhist teacher in California, and she was asking her, she said, well, these green Taras and red Taras and these entities and deities that they come up in Tibetan Buddhism, are they real? And the teacher just replied, they're as real as you and I.
Right.
And how real is that?
Yeah.
Well, I worked with a teacher in Grass Valley, California, E.J. Gould, for quite a long time, and he wrote a book called The American Book of the Dead,
Oh
which
yeah.
is his own sort of translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Right.
And he talks about the universe, the creation being describes as a multi-dimensional labyrinth, right?
Hmm.
Um, and that, well, I mean, if you study Tibetan Buddhism, they speak about the clear light, right? The void,
Right.
the clear light of objective reality, that out of nothing came everything, right?
Yeah.
The everything is relatively real because all phenomena is illusion, all coming from that singularity that is timeless and spaceless, right? So people do tend to get very excited about other dimensions and other realms.
Yeah.
And, I think it's important to understand they are real, but relatively real, right?
Totally.
So
Yeah.
I think, I mean, this is the McKenna brothers, right? Are you familiar with,
Oh yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Dennis and Terrence.
Yeah, and I know somebody who works with entheogens that lives down in Ashland, Martin Ball. Have you heard of Martin Ball?
No.
Oh, okay, he might be an interesting guest to interview at some point.
Sure.
But he took an issue with a lot of what Terrence McKenna talked about. Like Terrence went into his whole thing about the time wave theory in 2012, and Martin Ball basically said this guy just went off on this tangent that doesn't it doesn't really pan out, right?
Well, yeah. Well, obviously it didn't pan out because he predicted yeah, in December 2012, something huge was supposed to happen, right?
Right,
Which
right.
obviously didn't. I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
didn't happen.
and this is where it gets interesting too, because like I told you, early in my life, I had these profound experiences, but there was a delusional quality to a lot of it too.
Hmm.
That and things that I thought were happening at that time, after I reality tested them later, I had to kind of recognize, well, they might have seemed real to me, but you know, were they? I don't know.
Right. Maybe that wasn't. Yeah. No, I like to play with this idea too. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm not afraid to just talk about ideas without being sold on them. So I can talk about seeing spirits and entities and being spiritual and all this stuff. But I still I just stay skeptical of everything at this point. Um,
Yeah,
it's just kind of like, I think it could be that all this is a trick, and maybe like the going down this spiritual path and everything is just like another way you can live life, another way you can perceive life. But maybe that's not any more real than not being spiritual and not being on that enlightened path. And maybe life's not about that. Maybe life is just some crazy big game, like some video game that we're just playing, and there's no consequence and there's no nothing. Like, who really knows? So I'm not bought and sold into any of the spiritual talk, even though I like to entertain it. And it seems at this point, I get more from getting into these things than not.
yeah. Well, how it boils down for me. Ultimately, people can have a variety of experiences in all kinds of different realms and all kinds of different places. But when they come back home, how do they treat their kids? How
Right.
do they treat their family?
Hmm.
How are they interacting in their communities?
Right.
I mean, if you're, and Robert Anton Wilson spoke about this quite eloquently. He said, these people get involved in occultish and cultish kind of things that, casting spells or working with alchemy or whatever. And a lot of times they really get into trouble because they haven't done the hard work. They
Right.
haven't worked on this chakra and opening up and learning how to relate to people. So unless that work is done, and a lot of that work is done, I think, in therapy, it's done with counseling and therapy, healing that core wound so you can have healthy relationships, right?
Right.
Because all the cosmic bullshit that you can come up with, if you're beating your kids,
Oh
what the
yeah.
hell is it?
Totally. Yeah.
That's to me, that's what it all boils down to. How is this stuff actually helping me as a human being relate to other human beings and sort of evolve life in a healthy way on this planet?
Right. Yeah. Is it actually making a positive difference in your life or not? Because I think there's probably a lot of like this probably I think it can be beneficial for a lot of people. I've definitely had a lot of positive outcomes from my use of some of these substances. But I think there are probably people out there who don't need these substances. There's probably people out there who already have life sort of not figured out, but they're getting along just fine, and they're not having mental health problems, and they're not depressed, and they're not anxious, and they're enjoying their life, and they're living to the fullest, and they're already not afraid to be themselves. So maybe they don't need to do this. It's not like everyone has to do this. I think if it's gonna help, if it helps, then that's good. And if you're just gonna, I've heard, I think it was Trevor Miller actually who told me something along the lines of, he believes this stuff is medicine that we're supposed to use only when we're sick, and when we're not sick anymore, we shouldn't use this anymore. We don't need to take Tylenol if we don't have a headache, right? It's
Yeah, yeah,
so
and we all do carry some core wounding, whether it's in our ancestry, whether it's in our things that have happened to us in this life. We are all in some ways sick. We're not all, we all carry that wound. So I agree with Trevor. It is medicine, and that at a certain point, yeah, it's not necessary. I mean, when I first started drinking ayahuasca, I was interested in healing some parts of myself. and some parts of myself were healed. As I continue to work with the medicine, I now, am able to sit in support in ceremony. And so I'll still drink, but I want to be available to, if somebody runs outside and starts to run away, I can go in and, go out and help them. And if somebody is struggling or something and they need help, I can be available. So I think that's the process. Once you start to heal, then you're available to help.
Right. To spread that, to help. Yeah. So you've been part of the facilitators of some maybe ayahuasca ceremonies, and not just been the receiver.
Yeah. I'm not. I'm by no means. I'm not a curandero.
Right.
I haven't trained down in South America, and I really respect the people that do that work. But yeah, I do sit in support. I also sometimes play music in ceremony because that's been a big part of my life too.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Yeah. You. I remember reading something about in drumming or something.
Yeah. I've always enjoyed drumming. I have a collection of hand drums and have led drum circles for kids and adults and even seniors. I used to go to a senior center when I lived down in Sebastopol, California, and pass out hand drums to all these, old folks and get them drumming. And it was amazing, some of the stuff that happened. You'd see people just ignite and come alive. Yeah. So drumming is important to me. Music has always been a huge part of my life. And I played in rock bands for years. And when I started playing in ceremony, I found a totally different voice, and it's really, to me, a privilege to be able to offer that in that context.
It sounds like that is something, music in general, but I mean drumming maybe in particular. It can be something very, it can go hand in hand with psychedelic experiences sometimes. And I know I talked to someone who had a few experiences with the Native American church in Canada using peyote. And in there, he talked about their peyote ceremonies where they would, oh God, what did he say now? I think they were singing. They might have been drumming and singing, and they'd sort of take turns singing. And he talked about it being like a healing thing where when someone would be going through pain, their singing would falter, and they would become, and then as a group they would help bring that person up through drumming and song, and really empowering them through that group dynamic of creating sound or whatever while they were on peyote. And it sounds like a very interesting, and that's part of the Native American culture too, is the dancing and drumming and singing and chanting and stuff in ceremony, whether they use a psychedelic or not. It's a sort of part of that culture.
Yeah, drumming has always been, I think, a part of all shamanic cultures. I mean, a drum is probably the first way we communicated and made music. We banged on something, and and there's a very somatic quality too to touching the drum and hearing the drum. It resonates in the body,
Right.
And I worked with a guy named Arthur Hall who teaches what he calls what is it called? The alchemical something play shop. And he teaches how to facilitate drum circles. And he was talking about autistic children responding to the sound of a drum, where it could break through some of the protective layers, or where other things couldn't get through. They could feel that because it went directly into their body and directly into their heart. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like there's something about that some kind of steady beat can really just get you going. I don't know what it is. They do that in ayahuasca. They don't use a drum in Peru anyway. They use a bundle of dried leaves. I forget the name of it. What they use, but they bang it, and it's very fast. It's and then they sing over that.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's a very powerful thing to experience. Well, especially while you're on ayahuasca as well, it can really transform your experience.
I've often felt that kind of sound or vibration is almost like a carrier wave. Almost like making an electrical connection to another chamber,
Right.
through, and I mean, we live in a highly technological society now where things are transmitted in a lot of different ways, mostly electrical through, radio waves or television signals. But, I think some of these indigenous cultures had shamanic technologies that knew how to transmit in other ways that were just as powerful as the scientific way that we transmit things.
Right. Yeah, when you start thinking about this idea that we can send things through the air and we just take it for granted, like I can send you a movie and you can download it on your phone from Australia and you can do so in like 10 seconds with a high-speed connection. And we're just like, oh yeah, that's normal. You can just, or we can just talk to each other. Like right now, we're pretty far apart, but we're talking at the same, with barely any delay at all. And we think that this is maybe this is the only way we can do that. There's probably other ways to send information. Like it's invisible. We don't see it going through the air, but it's there. So yeah, there's probably some other technologies and some things that we're not tapping into, I'm sure.
Well, and I think as you become more clear in your work and your process, and this is why I like meditation. Meditation is a tool to relax the mind, to get out of that beta state, right? That monkey mind. And once you are dropping down, and I use a lot of body-based meditations, but once you drop down and are present and you're out of the little drama with me at the center, then yes, you do have access to other channels,
Right.
And there are all kinds of transmissions going on all the time.
Right.
And I think once you really start to open up, then you can have access.
Yeah, I believe it. I think meditation is something I've been very slowly getting into, sort of half meditation, half prayer sort of thing. I've really never done that much in my life, but then over the past couple of years, it's been something I've been exploring more. And I've always growing up, the idea of meditation, I was always like, what the hell am I going to do? Just sit and stare at a wall and just try not to think about stuff. But you always end up thinking about stuff. So it's so hard to just not think. But I think the idea is to not think about, you're going to think about things, but to just sort of let that ease. I don't know. I'm definitely not a schooled meditator.
Well, things are going to arise as you meditate. And it's about just watching. You just watch. Right. You don't let things take you away. I mean, I've practiced Vipassana meditation for probably 20 years now. And, with Vipassana, you always start out at the tip of the nose. You're basically just sensing the air as it comes in, the air as it goes out, and that's your anchor, right? And so when the mind starts to spin out, as soon as you remember, you come back.
Right. Yeah,
and
focus on the breath.
Yeah, and that's why an anchor like that is useful, because it's a place to stay with, to hold.
To not get too lost in some thought taking you down the rabbit hole or whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
I found it useful, even in my very limited use of it, of just maybe 5 minutes in the morning before I start my day or something, just kind of doing a little meditation just to remind myself what I'm doing that day, who I am, what I'm trying to accomplish, everything, and being thankful and all this kind of stuff. And it seems to help. It seems to help me just focus and not fall down patterns, like bad habits right off the bat. Because sometimes I wake up, I don't even think at all. I'm just like, okay, stumble into the bathroom, go make something to eat, go do mindless whatever. Whereas when you're kind of, I guess it's that mindfulness people talk about with meditation, is practicing mindfulness, being aware of your decisions, your choices, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's the difference between running on automatic pilot or running like a machine and actually being clear enough to make conscious choices. And
Yeah.
that, and what meditation can do is ground you in that still place where you're present all the time, and then you can recognize, the phenomenal world is just that. Who I am essentially isn't that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that idea could help you sort of not get caught up in something goes wrong. Maybe you don't get as angry because you're just like, oh, whatever, it's okay. I'm not gonna be too attached to if someone insults me today, or
Yeah. Yeah. Take it personally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Kevin, this has been a really fun conversation. Thanks so much for talking to me. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you maybe would like to mention, or?
No, I think I think we've covered quite a bit, and
Yeah.
I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah.
And looking forward to meeting you at the conference in October.
Yeah, totally. I'm looking forward to that as well. It sounds like there's a lot of great speakers. What was the website again if people want to check that out?
Psychedelic Psychotherapy.ca.
Okay.
And it's the Psychedelic Psychotherapy, second annual Psychedelic Psychotherapy Forum
Right.
in Victoria, which is in October. Victoria is a beautiful place.
Oh,
You
yeah.
probably,
Oh,
right? You're
definitely.
from,
Yeah, fall on Vancouver Island is a great beautiful place. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, I will see you there. Thanks so
All
much,
right.
Kevin.
Take care.